Hello, my name is John Reynolds. On this episode of Extraordinary Life Stories, I'm talking to Debbie Wosskow OBE. Debbie is recognised as one of the most prominent serial entrepreneurs in the UK. She's the former CEO of Love Home Swap, a subscription-based home exchange business which she sold for circa $53 million in 2017. Debbie co-founded AllBright, the largest global network for women, and she's passionate about empowering women through increased access to capital. This is very close to my heart as a father to two daughters growing up in a world where Debbie's trailblazing could help in any way to influence them to achieve their ambitions. I'm really looking forward to talking with Debbie. Debbie, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure. Tell me, who's Debbie Wosskow?
God, that's a big question. Well, I suppose it's a question that you increasingly ask yourself as you get a bit older. And because I've had moments of self-reflection in terms of doing things like writing books,
Sure.
it makes you think about who am I? Why have I made the decisions that I've made in my life? And I think by any measure, as a woman, as a young woman, as a female entrepreneur, I've had a reasonably unconventional path. So there's the stuff that you read, and that says, I'm a businesswoman, I've been successful in my business, I've had a few gongs and some stuff in the paper. But I suppose for me, the point to it all is I think in life, you have to stand for something. Yeah. And I spent quite a lot of time, particularly in this decade, and I turn 50 next year, thinking about what I stand for and how I show up in the world and how I can use some of my muscle to make a difference. And the thing that's driven me throughout my life is creating better economic opportunities for women at every stage. And I would never have framed it in that way in my 20s or 30s. But as you mature a bit, I think we're only as good as we identify our own purpose. And I would say that that's mine.
That's really interesting to me, with 12 and 13-year-old daughters growing up, wanting to make a difference in the world and be successful. That's so relevant. I want to take you back, though, to when you were growing up. What did a young Debbie want to do?
Well, my mother would say, darling, you've always been you. She doesn't always mean that as a compliment, I don't think, from a young age. But I grew up in a matriarchy. I'm one of 5 kids. My mum and my grandmother were entrepreneurs. They would never describe themselves as that, so that's kind of a modern fancy world. But I'm from a Jewish immigrant family where everybody worked for themselves. And when you try to distill why you've done the things that you've done and the way that you've done them, I honestly think a big part of it was I had no role models, male or female, who did jobs for other people. That just wasn't a thing in our community. And my grandparents, particularly my mother's mother, my maternal grandmother, ran a small chain of sweet shops and off licenses because she'd been widowed at a young age. And my formative memories were driving around with her in her armoured van, dropping money off at the bank. She never learnt to reverse, and that's something we have in common because I'm a notoriously awful driver. So I think some of that in the nature-nurture conversation about entrepreneurship that I've been part of for a long time, a big part of it, and for women and young women, is that you have to see it to be it. And the women in my family, for better for worse, were strong women who had a lot of kids and who worked for themselves. And they blended, not always easily, being a mum and having a business. And I think that maybe some of that's a DNA thing because I've done it, my sisters all work for themselves. But I think also the entrepreneurial leap, which you will recognise, is de-risked if you see it around you all the time.
Yeah,
and this question about, can I have a family and how do I've never had to ask myself that question because that's all I'd ever seen was people doing it, was women doing it, was strong women doing it. So again, back to the point on what's the point or who am I, what am I trying to do? I think a big part of it is to show women and girls, and I have a daughter and a son, that this is possible. It's not always easy. And there's a huge ongoing conversation about work-life balance and what does it mean in women's careers post the pandemic and working from home. I've spoken about that a lot this week at a big conference, and it's a bit controversial because I firmly believe women need to be in the room, and I really worry that working from home is a problem for feminism, for women at work, because I think we become less visible. But all of these things, I think, you can figure out for yourself in whatever way works for you, if you see people doing it. And those were my formative years.
The visibility of it is crucial. The girls I mentioned growing up 12 and 13, the education system, the curriculum doesn't teach you any of this.
Yeah.
Inspirational people like yourself that are breaking the glass ceilings, pioneering the opportunity for sort of more diversity and inclusion is great, but it's not being taught at the young age unless it comes from the parents, which clearly is what influenced you. What more can be done in the education curriculum?
I can talk about that endlessly, and I've always had a role. I think that business has a really important role in politics to articulate and bridge what we see in our world to what we see in the real world, if you like.
Yes.
And a big part of that does start with young girls and young boys, actually. And having a daughter and a son, I firmly believe that regardless of the gender, basic business skills aren't taught in schools, and they really aren't taught to girls. So I've played some small role in doing that, but I'm very conscious that I operate in a privileged world. My kids are educated privately, you know, that's a different dynamic. I think there's a lot of talk in government circles at the moment with the present Prime Minister about taking math skills up to 18, and that's what I'm not kind of arguing against that, although that would be a disaster for both of my children who are not natural mathematicians. Nonetheless, I feel like a lot of the stuff that I learned in my very first business, which I set up when I was 25, so I was young, I'd been a management consultant out of Oxford, you know, pretty standard thing to do, was around the realities of managing cash flow, right? In your first business, that's the thing you learn. And those skills stay with you in that I always check the bank account every day. You know, there's some very basic maths that you need to get your head around about ensuring that your billings are greater than your over. I mean, it sounds bleeding obvious, but I did a philosophy degree, right? So I'm really good at talking about Descartes' Cartesian circle, but there hasn't been a great deal of use in my adult working life. You know, it's given me a good brain, but that thing, I'd kind of grown up with that because we were very un-English as a family. We talked about money around the kitchen table. I do that with my own kids. I think it's really important not to be bashful about that. But I think teaching those basic business skills, which I learned on the job in my first business, about cash flow, P&L, balance sheet. You know, I say it to my kids, to my point, who are not very good at maths, but I preach to them that my whole day is spent figuring out percentages, and if I knock off 10% here, how can I, you know, that sort of basic business maths.
Absolutely.
And I think that we need to be really clear about how we set children, in particular girls, up to feel comfortable with this. I felt comfortable with it in spite of my education because I'm a SWAT and I had a very, very classical education of doing English, history, A-levels and an arts degree. But I'd grown up around it. So how do we embed that basic comfort with business awareness that stands young entrepreneurs in very good stead? And in my life as an investor in my AllBright life, which is the business that I most recently exited, which became the world's largest network for women's careers, I've been privileged enough to see female entrepreneurs pitch all the time. And if I were to mark their homework for them, this is a horrendous generalization, but you know, for the sake of this conversation,
I get what you mean.
I think that they're not confident enough in owning their numbers. And I think that can be traced back to a very young age, where I don't think we're teaching young women enough of the basic business skills that then stand them in good stead on that entrepreneurial journey. And let's be clear, pandemic has been terrible for women's careers. Pre the pandemic, 2.17% of capital went to back a female founder in the UK, which is a crap number. Post the pandemic, it's %. So we're going backwards. And I think there are lots of reasons why that happens. There isn't a magic bullet, and I talk about this endlessly, and it's a combination of the following. Women don't invest, and so the majority of pen holders are men. 2% of partners in a venture capital fund are women, 2%. So if you have 98% of people who are check writers being men, then things happen. Women tend to fund and found smaller businesses. So they don't scale up in the same way. So perhaps they never even get to that fundraising point of view. Women lack networks. So our networks are not naturally as good as men's. That's what a big part of what AllBright was about. We don't have a golf club. It's not in our DNA. The mean age to start a business in the UK is 32, and that's when women have kids. Our childcare costs are greater than any money we can earn in our first years as an entrepreneur. You know, I had a lot of business success in my 30s. They were my big earning years. Mm-hmm. But that's because I'd had an exit in my 20s. So I could afford, as a single mum with 2 kids, to have childcare costs that were greater than my earnings. Most people can't. So in my life now, I'm jumping around chronologically, but
Sure.
one of the things I'm very focused on with Anna, my co-founder, we've set up a sort of studio, I guess, an arc for our investments and our ability to add muscle to new businesses called the Better Life Company. And part of what that exists to do is to fund and accelerate female entrepreneurs in their 40s who would be brilliant founders of businesses, but will not do it, cannot do it, because the risk of going from some earnings to zero earnings, which is what happens when you found a business, as you know, is just too great.
Yeah.
And I think that's a massive untapped arc of potential economic upside and success, both for founders and funders, that we just can't get to. So in our own way, what are we focused on? Giving women a voice, highlighting the issue, getting more money in female hands, by which we mean there need to be more female investors, there need to be more funds that have diversity at their core, but also recognising that the continuation of a brain drain that happens in our 30s when women are having children, if they're having them, carries on to their 40s. In our 50s, which is a big area of focus now, so I'm very focused on perimenopause and menopause in terms of work that I'm doing in a business that I've backed called the Better Menopause. 25% of women over the age of 50 leave the workforce because they can't handle their menopause symptoms. That's assuming we've stayed there in the first place, right?
Yeah.
So every stage, the odds are stacked against us. What happens to women in their perimenopausal years, which, by the way, at age 38 onwards, it's not 60. And this is a conversation that I was totally unaware of, and I'm nearly 50. Nobody ever talked to me about it. I'd never had a conversation with my mother about her menopause. We just didn't talk about that stuff.
No.
But it's affecting women at an age when for a man, is their peak career years. Yes. A quarter of women leaving the workforce because they're not getting the right medical support for how they're feeling. It's just a disaster, right? So we need to have the conversation. It's costing UK PLC 10 billion a year, with those women who are highly trained and highly skilled and very experienced just going. So I think that's the point of what's the point.
Yeah, sure.
If I can help on all of that by talking, by shining a light, by investing my money, by encouraging men and women, because men have got to be on the bus with us on this. And I really learned that in AllBright. Unless you have men in the room and allies and champions, people wanting to have this conversation, it doesn't change. How can it change when 98% of wealth is sitting in male hands?
Yeah, got to work together.
I think so. And I think it's absolutely that. It's a partnership. It's a partnership for partners of women, as in romantic, marital, otherwise partners of women, for the people that we work with, and for investors to realise, as is the case, that for women over the age of 50, 60% of spend and consumer products is in their hands, right? There's a hugely untapped audience. So we need to understand how they're feeling and what they're doing and what they want as consumers, but also in the world of work, how to keep them there. Because if we're all going to live to 100, it's kind of a long game.
Absolutely.
We can't be dropping out halfway through, right?
No, you've articulated that so well. My wife's going through the menopause. And then you've got the dynamic of the fact that I don't understand it because I'm a man and I've got my own pressures of my business and so on. And actually we're filming in the Jack studio, Just Ask a Question, the social media mental health platform. What are your thoughts on Jack?
I think any conversation that any of us can have at any age or stage about how we're feeling is incredibly important. And I haven't always been good at that myself. And I think in the world of business, and particularly as a woman, you know, I started my first business at 25. There's no way I would have talked to anybody about how I was feeling, because that would have been a sign of weakness, right? You're in a massive minority. Your game face and your makeup and your heels better be on, and every single room you go into is full of men. So you don't ever want to show that, you know, for years. And this, I think, is changing. But when I had my kids, who are now 12 and 14, I never spoke about the fact that I was pregnant, that I was having children, that I'd had children. I mean, famously, I'm not saying this is great, but I did go into labour at my desk. You know, I did a meeting in the morning, I stood up, everyone nearly had a heart attack because I was so pregnant, you couldn't really kind of tell from. So I think that is shifting. I think actually, whilst the pandemic has been economically bad for women's careers, and I really worry about working from home and what that means for our visibility, one of the positive things was I think we saw into men's living rooms and they saw into ours. We saw captains of industry engaging with their kids on Zoom who were homeschooling. Like I feel like if anything shifted a bit, it's a recognition that people have families. I still think it's hugely complex for women. I really do. I think that, you know, it's interesting. One of the roles that I do is I act as a mentor for a couple of women in private equity-backed businesses who are stepping out from COO to be CEO. Okay. And one of the things they really want to know, these are businesses that are in the middle of transactions, is how do I engage with investors who are all male and I'm the only woman? What do I talk to them about? Because I can't really talk about, in the instance of these women, I can't really talk about football. I can't really talk about golf. I can't mention my kids. Like, what do I say? You know? And I think, honestly, that has been a big question, open question for women, if you're always in the minority, is what do I talk about if there are vast swathes of my life that are just off limits because it makes them feel uncomfortable? Often, if you're a peer to a male investor, chairman, potential acquirer of a business who has children and who has a wife, and it may or may not be the case that that wife is at home, it's a difficult conversation to start having, and so you tend not to. So that's a point around children and families. I think, you know, the mental health question as a mum, I'm extremely grateful that these conversations are much more live and palatable. I think my children have a vocabulary that I certainly didn't have at that age. But it's also a bit of a scary time to be a parent. I mean, maybe it always was. But, you know, I feel like some of this stuff is hard, and it's hard to figure out what the right thing to do is. I think in the world of work, I think you have high-profile people talking about difficult times they've had in their lives in a way that they wouldn't have done in the past, and that can only be a positive thing. And then the sort of final underline on that is my particular area of focus, you know, is 40 plus women. And I think what I have seen up close is the impact that menopause symptoms can have on women's mental health, because it has such an impact often on anxiety, on confidence, with women being misdiagnosed and given antidepressants. I think the more that we can understand how that time in life can make you feel and what the different solutions are. And that's why we've launched the Better Menopause, and we've got a series of supplement products developed, medically developed, because whilst HRT is great, it's not a panacea for absolutely everybody. No. The earlier we start having the conversation about how we feel, the better that we're likely to feel, because we get more help.
And it does feel like there's a shift. I mean, you've just been really open then. You're talking about stuff that you quite simply wouldn't have talked about X amount of years ago. This program has been inspired on the basis of the fact that I'm enjoying learning from people, and people are sharing and talking about the things that, you know, we all learn from. In context of a couple of times you've referenced the business you started at 25. Was that Love Home Swap?
No, that was Mantra. So I've had a few moments.
I'm interested to know.
Yeah, and you know, look, my first business was a classic first business, and it was an agency. I think agencies and consultancies are brilliant first businesses because they really teach you about cash flow and P&L. You're always 2 client wins away from greatness and 2 client losses away from disaster. You can go a long way with a phone. I don't even think we really had computers then, it was a long time ago, and a lot of chutzpah. And we built a business that became the biggest agency in London. We exited to one of the marketing services groups. It was a brilliant first experience and a lot of fun. I learned a lot about people and culture and how to work with them and how to manage them. It's a particular challenge to do that when you're the boss at 25 and most people are at least a decade older than you. And that, again, I think is a challenge as a young woman that I learned a lot about. And it was great. And then off the back of that, I set up Love Home Swap, which is a business I'm well known for. That was a sort of at the beginning of the sharing economy, and it was inspired by the movie The Holiday, which for a lot of my life, every time I spoke, that was kind of playing behind my head. And that was a business that was a moment in time, continues to be a moment in time. I sold it to Wyndham, the hotel group. It was a very successful exit. I also worked in the business with my brother, my youngest brother, which was a great thing to do.
Yeah.
It was a business that when people still approach me about to say it changed their lives, and without sounding like an idiot, that's kind of an exciting thing. And the reason is because you have people who are so passionate, who have traveled the world, with 4 children and stayed in people's hotels and homes, and I think to the point on standing for something, what that was about was giving people amazing experiences and taking them out of their own life and day-to-day experience and allowing them to swap lives with other people.
Sure.
And there's a richness and a sort of meaning that comes from that made and continues to make a massive difference to people's lives. It was a great 5 years of my life. I
love that. And there's an element of absolute pride there, and legacy, achievement. You're an OBE. There's so many, there's real business success there. How important is legacy and achievement to you?
Well, I guess there's some very practical ways to answer that question, which is I can only be good at what I do if I make money, because I'm in business. So how do you measure success? If I'm not making money, I'm like I can do a lot of talking, but in the end, the things that I do have to be successful. They have to create wealth for me and others. I always raise venture capital or private equity money in what I do. They don't give you it for free. So you're locked into a cycle of generating returns. And I'm tough with myself on that because I've done it a number of times, and you're only as good as your last hit. So I'm very driven by that, and I'm extremely metrics driven. I still check the bank account every day. I'm a hard taskmaster on performance, and I'm hardest on myself. So that I think is important. The stuff around the edges, things like OBEs, I mean, look, it's a lovely day out. My father, who's never hugely impressed by anything I do, I think there's something about coming from an immigrant family where my grandparents didn't really speak English, and then being in Buckingham Palace, and I got my gong from Charles. That's a very nice day for everybody. So that was a nice thing. But it doesn't mean above and beyond that, it doesn't really mean anything. It's a nice accolade. And I've had quite a few of those, and they're nice things. It's not the point. The point for me is I'm a very motivated person. I like to feel like I'm contributing every day. I'm not good at doing nothing. I can't do nothing. I like to be busy, and I like outcomes. And I think when I've had times in my life where I've been less happy, because we think about contentment and happiness, it's because I haven't felt driven towards a goal or a number of goals. So I really need that. And I go through a tough process with myself on what they are. And I think when you come out of a business after an exit, which of course everybody's dream, and you check the bank account, and I'm not like, all that stuff is really important, and I have a very nice life, but as I always say, I've worked my ass off for it.
I get it.
Forgetting that for a second, what can happen a lot, and if you speak to any exited entrepreneurs about how they feel the day after, it's very weird. Particularly for me, where I'm a very simplistic entrepreneur, and my businesses, I tend to embody the brand. I'm always terribly impressed by people who've got these really complex SaaS businesses that they're excited about. It's just not my thing, right? No. So when you decouple your personal identity from the business that you've built, and you're on day +1, you're like, who am I?
Lost your identity.
Right? Who am I?
Yeah.
I don't have a team. I don't have anywhere to go.
Yeah.
I've always been Debbie Wosskow, who's what? That's gone. I've got to start again. What does that mean? Yeah. And how do I distill what I want? And I've more or less done a business a decade. And what you want changes. Partly changes because you've got an economic buffer, and so that does change what you do and how you do it. I think it changes around age, not energy, because I'm ridiculously Duracell bunny-like about life. But I have been the founder CEO a number of times, and it does get a bit tired. To the extent that I think the older you get, the more that you can deploy your skill set, your address book, the multiplier effect of you to take more bets at the same time. And that's a big part of how I think about the next decade for me. I want to have, which is why Anna and I have got this Better Life company in our sort of studio, if you like.
Sure.
We want to generate off the back of our ideas and experience 5 or 6 businesses that sit under an arc where we incentivize female CEOs and we bring investors in alongside our own capital so that we have just got more bets and different things to think about. That feels motivating for me. But I have to do quite a lot of work to figure that out because I kind of know how to do one thing. And so the default is to do that thing again. But there are other ways to live and to flex. And then I think the balance for me is always money and purpose. So ideally, money and purpose are connected. But also, I like to do things that don't make me any money, that give back. I don't like to do too many of them because ultimately, if you're a commercial person, they can be a bit frustrating. So I pick those pretty carefully to sit alongside the rest of the things that I do so it makes sense. So I'm on the board of the Women's Prize for Fiction. I'm a massive reader. Women's literature is read 1/10 as often as men's. You know, there's a kind of reason to do it. But I think you also have to be quite disciplined about what you say no to. And I've not always been disciplined about that. Because I'm an enthusiast. I can get excited about anything and I want to help. So you can end up hugely overcommitted. So the process of this year, which has been, 9 months now out of AllBright, is to say, okay, there's a basic triangle for me that says have fun, make money, don't work with and that's quite important. So around that triangle, what does it look like? What do I say no to? And how do I give it some sort of shape? So my shape is the things I care about are diversity, health, wellness, emotional well-being, that kind of category, economic empowerment, generally for people who aren't economically empowered. Okay, that sounds obvious. It took me quite a while to get that straight. Now I'm straight, it's easier to say no. And there's a massive power that comes with age about learning how to say no to things. That's a reasonably recent thing for me.
You've really articulated that well. And I think you've got that incredible experience of being the founder, the entrepreneur. And you said it yourself, hard taskmaster on yourself. Right? Being at the desk when you're going to the labour, let alone I can feel it right now. You back companies, you back entrepreneurs. What do you look for? Because that hard taskmaster, I can imagine you're looking for certain attributes in someone that, I suppose, would probably remind you of yourself.
It's difficult, isn't it? I'm very fortunate to work with Anna Jones in most of what I do. And my lesson in my partnership with her, which is the most successful partnership of my life, with the romantic or otherwise, not romantic in this case, is that we're extremely different in terms of skill set, but we're very emotionally similar in terms of how we handle the good and the bad. And that, I think, is what makes a really successful partnership. So the things that she does are really different to the things that I do. Our background was totally different. She was the CEO of Hearst. So when we approach a task, it's very obvious what I'm going to do and what she's going to do. We've never really had to deal with that. It's just kind of obvious, right? But when good things happen, we deal with it in the same way. When bad things happen, we don't shout. We have no short-term memory, either of us. We can't remember how crap it was the day before. And we find dark humour and a gin and tonic and everything. So we've always just kind of rolled. And we had some really dark times, right? We were running a physical space business during the pandemic. That was no fun. So what the point on that is, when we look to back people, we back them together. We always have a different take on things. Anna's much more patient than I am. Much more patient. I'm not patient. I like to make quick decisions on things, and that can sometimes mean I make the wrong decision on people because I just want it to be done. And I think if I mark my homework over a 25-year entrepreneurial career, the biggest mistakes have been around hiring or partnering in a hurry. And we all do it. It's a particular cadence around raising venture capital or private equity finance, because inevitably you've sold the dream in advance of having any money. Someone gives you the money and you're like, we don't have the team to deliver on any of this. And you're like, right, you, and you, and then 50% of them are just wrong. So, and you can hire an expertise, but you've really got to hire for culture and flair. And they're very hard to interview for. So I think AJ keeps me honest because she's just more considered on this stuff. I think backing other entrepreneurs is super hard, right? It's hard because I've got a lot of experience. And if we are particularly targeting this demographic that might not have as much experience, then you've got to give them room to grow. And you're an investor, but you're a coach to some extent. And you're recognizing, which is what AJ is very good at with me, there's just a special source of stuff that I have that I just can't expect other people to have. And that's okay, right?
Yeah.
That's why we're backing them in this way, because I can do my bit.
Sure.
Again, it's the same sort of conversation as the reason why I know Anna is amazing. She does different things. So what we really try to do with the entrepreneurs that we see is not just look for mini-me's, because that doesn't always work, but because we're setting things up so that we can give them some money, help raise some more money, give them expertise, give them a dress book, give them some jobs, we're looking for something different. So it's a process. Having said that, as an angel investor, I've backed 3 different young women in their 20s because I see some of me in them. That's the kind of ultimate vanity, isn't it? But I think I get who you are and where you are and I'm here kind of thing. So I think it's a bit of both. Part of the reason to do that is because I get a lot of energy from seeing young women where I feel like they're on a journey and I can help. And I guess that's part of it's economically invested because I think that they're all going to do well. And I want, on a very basic level, I'd like to 10x my stake, great. But it's also because I can see how I can help them to grow. And when I was 25, I didn't know any women like that, right?
So you had no mentors.
I had some men, but it's kind of a different thing.
Yeah.
They were just hard to find. And I'm not saying they're any easier to find now, but when I come across those young women, which I do through things like through the AllBright network and through Female Founders Pitch Days, and because people know Anna and I invest, there's a special moment and a special relationship that comes through that also gives me emotional energy.
Yeah, I can tell. And I imagine when you got that person you really believe in, you invested in, you're probably a formidable mentor because you've got the experience and you are financially driven by it, but also you actually want to help shape them. And you're coming from a place of experience.
Yeah,
right?
Totally.
We've touched on this, but just in its actual definition, because anyone that would already know of you or having listened and watched this knows you're now successful. How do you define success?
Look, one thing I feel strongly about is women need to talk about money. We don't talk about it enough. We need to get rich, be comfortable and deploy our capital in backing other women. It's the only way we change the ecosystem. So I am someone who likes money under the bed. I'm very driven to make sure that I am financially secure, which doesn't mean I want like boats and planes and things. I've never been driven by that, but I want to have the life I want to have and feel secure. So that's a big driver for me, and I don't think women talk about that enough.
I'd agree.
We should be very, very clear on that. I think for me, that notwithstanding, a big part of it is about optionality. So what I mean by that is being able to pick and choose what I do away from a point of necessity. And that, I think, for me is the ultimate joy. I've been doing a lot of thinking about what brings me joy. And some of it is stuff that's easy to execute on, fresh air and exercise and dancing. I realised I don't do that anymore. I've been trying to do that with my friends and whatever. But what gives me energy is variety. What brings me joy is interacting with people who I get a kick out of. And success for me is giving myself the opportunity to be able to do that. That really matters.
Yeah.
And then I think it's being in the world. That doesn't make a lot of sense as a category. But what I mean by that is I live in London. I live in central London. I live 10 minutes away from where we are now. And I realised that times in my life, particularly pandemic time when none of us could do anything, didn't feel very successful times for me because I wasn't interacting with the world. And so I get a lot of energy from culture. I'm a theatre person. I like high heels on concrete. I like fresh air, but I do like that. So I think it's tasking myself to make sure that I plan my life for maximum joy. And that's where success comes from. That's non-financial. It's feeling like I did a thing today and that was very cool. Yeah. And I've got the ability to make that happen. And it might have cost me nothing, but it's still a successful outcome for the day. And that makes me happy. I like to have days where something happens.
Yeah. there's so many ways of keeping physically fit and things we can do to keep mentally fit. They always have been, but they're so much more highlighted now. Ice baths, go for a run, yoga.
Yeah.
What works for you? Because I can tell you keep physically fit and I can just see the focus, but what do you do that works for you?
It's routine for me that gives me a massive amount of comfort, whatever's happening, and wherever I'm traveling to, it's the same routine. So I train 7 days a week every morning. I train around the corner from here at a place called BXR across the road.
Cool.
And I do a mix of different things, which I've really adjusted to as I've got older, because I used to run and do HIIT and that was all I did. And I've definitely found doing more strength training. I'm not a natural yoga person, but I do now do 2 of those classes in a week. I like a class. That's because I spend my day telling everybody what to do. And for me, there's a massive switch off that comes from just turning up and doing what you're told. So that's definitely part of it. And the community in a place is important too. So that's just kind of non-negotiable for me. I'm trying to, I do cryo and I do the infrared, and I'm not religious about all of that, but I sort of like doing it.
Yeah.
But the thing for me that never shifts is the 6:50 a.m. class. I just do it, whatever's happening.
Fair play.
So that, and I think if you're used to work travel a lot, which I am, I think, again, that can be very discombobulating, and particularly if you're in places for short periods of time. I'm used to doing stupid things like going to Australia for 24 hours. I think if you can switch on your routine, there's a tremendous amount of mental strength that comes from that.
Interesting.
On the mental health bit, I'm not good at meditating. I have tried. It's not really my thing. I read, and I honestly find I read fiction, I read literature. That for me is a massive switch off. I read every night, even if I'm late. I just find I'm not naturally a great sleeper, and that's a big part of my routine. And then sleep hygiene. That's the final thing, which I've had to learn the hard way. So my phone isn't by the side of the bed. I try not to look at my phone before bedtime. I sleep with earplugs and an eye mask, blah, blah, blah. That I've had to work on, because that doesn't come necessarily easy.
It's a constant time. Thank you for sharing that. I've loved listening to you. We've run out of time for me to carry on asking any more questions. There's so much to learn, though, from what you have just shared with me. Thank you so much for joining me, Debbie. Thank you.
No.